Before we continue toward the truth recorded in this hololithic fragment, lend your strength to this cause. Mark your approval. Bind yourself with subscription oath. Ignite the hype protocol, and speak in the comment vault the name of the chapter you hold in highest regard. Your voice is noted, and your loyalty judged.
Imagine a space marine chapter so devoted to the Emperor's light that even when branded heretics, they never stopped believing in him. Picture warriors in regal purple and gold power armor, fighting against aliens and demons with uncompromising zeal, yet hunted by the very Imperium they once served. These are the Soul Drinkers, a chapter whose saga is one of glory, betrayal, and grim irony. They have been called the Imperium's most loyal heretics, and for good reason. How can devout space marines end up declared traitors? What twisted path led them to rebel against the Imperium while still venerating the Emperor? Brace yourself for a journey into the dark, dramatic tale of the Soul Drinkers chapter, a story spanning millennia of war. From their noble founding and proud battle honors to the catastrophic events that cast them out, prepare to learn how a brotherhood of space marines went from exemplars of loyalty to excommunicate traitors, all while clinging to the belief that they, not the rest of the Imperium, remained true to the Emperor. It's a cautionary chronicle of heroism and heresy in equal measure. This is the story of the Soul Drinkers, the chapter that gave everything for the Imperium, only to be damned by it. Chapter 1. Origins of the Soul Drinkers. The tale begins in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when the Imperium was rebuilding and reordering its armies. The Soul Drinkers chapter was born during the Second Founding, created from the lineage of the Imperial Fists. Legend holds that none other than Primarch Rogal Dorn himself oversaw their creation. Dorn took warriors from the Imperial Fist Legion, particularly those skilled in rapid strikes and shipboarding actions, and formed a new chapter. As a symbol of this chapter's purpose and loyalty, Dorn presented them with one of the Imperial Fist's most revered relics, an ancient weapon known as the Soulspear. This artifact, said to have been wielded by Dorn during the Great Crusade, was given to the Soul Drinkers as a mark of trust and unity. It was a message that, even as the legions split into separate chapters, all sons of Dorn remained brethren. Proudly bearing the chalice insignia and clad in purple armor, the Soul Drinkers set out to earn their place in the Emperor's service. From the very start, the Soul Drinkers had a reputation as aggressive shock troops. They excelled in fleet-based operations boarding actions, orbital assaults, sudden strikes much like their progenitors. Every battle brother carried a personal copy of the Catechisms Martial, a tome of martial philosophy penned by one of their early heroes, Chaplain Denyathos. This book of wisdom guided their conduct in war and faith. The chapter's name, Soul Drinkers, reflected a spiritual belief. They performed a ritual called the Rites of the Libation, wherein a commander would symbolically consume a drop of an enemy's blood from a golden chalice while intoning, "Know your enemy." Through their enhanced omophagia organ, they gleaned memories from the enemy's flesh, a practice they believed gave insight without tainting their souls. To the Soul Drinkers, drinking the essence of the foe in a sanctified way kept them pure, even as they confronted the worst of humanity's enemies. Over time, this practice, along with their chalice iconography, made their name feared by foes and somewhat unsettling to allies. The Imperial bureaucracy was never entirely comfortable with a chapter called Soul Drinkers, but results spoke louder than aesthetic concerns. In their early history, the Soul Drinkers fought with distinction alongside other Imperial forces. They may not have been as famous as the Ultramarines or Blood Angels, but they built a steady record of victories. Importantly, the Soul Drinkers saw themselves as exemplars of the Emperor's will above petty politics. They were known to take the side of justice and common folk, even if it meant stepping on the toes of the powerful, a trait that would later define their downfall. But in the beginning, this independent streak was just viewed as honorable zeal. During the War of the Beast in M32, a galaxy-wide orc invasion that nearly brought the Imperium to its knees, the Soul Drinkers answered the call to arms without hesitation. Along with many other successors of the Imperial Fists, they activated the ancient Last Wall Protocol, essentially reuniting with fellow chapters to form a makeshift legion in defense of Terra. Chapter Master Euclidius of the Soul Drinkers led a significant part of this combined force. It's recorded that the chapter even contributed warships and troops to reinforce the parent Imperial Fists, who had been devastated in that conflict. This act tells us that at that time, the Soul Drinkers were regarded as loyal sons of Dorn, their gene seed pure and their honor unsullied. They fought bravely to beat back the colossal orc threat, and when the war ended, they even gave some of their strength to help rebuild the Imperial Fists chapter itself. In other words, they helped save the Imperium and restore their Primarch's own chapter, a point of pride that would later make their fall from grace all the more poignant. Fast forward to the 36th millennium, the age of apostasy, and you'll find the Soul Drinkers again on the right side of history. This was the era of High Lord Goj Vandire's tyranny, a time of corruption and civil strife within the Imperium. Vandire had usurped control of the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, plunging mankind into the bloody rain of blood. Many Imperial forces stood paralyzed or were co-opted by Vandire's mad regime. But not the Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes saw the evil in Vandire's rule and eventually rose against it. The Soul Drinkers were among the 4 chapters who spearheaded the coalition to depose the tyrant. In 378 M36, along with the Imperial Fists, Firehawks, and Black Templars, the Soul Drinkers launched a crusade directly at Terra. Yes, this chapter literally stormed the gates of the Imperial Palace on the Emperor's behalf to end a traitorous High Lord's reign. During this so-called Terran crusade, Soul Drinkers fought and bled on the sacred soil of humanity's homeworld, helping besiege the ecclesiarchal palace. It was a savage campaign. One can imagine the mix of pride and horror in a Soul Drinker's hearts as they battled across the war-torn streets of Terra itself. Pride in defending the Emperor's truth. Horror that it was the Imperium's own high officers who had driven things to such extremes. Ultimately, Vandire met his end, at the hands of the Adepta Sororitas, as history notes. An order was restored. In the aftermath, the Soul Drinkers could stand tall as loyal heroes who saved the Imperium from itself. Such history is crucial to understanding the Soul Drinkers' mindset. They were not a chapter that had any history of treachery or disobedience. On the contrary, they often took up arms to correct the Imperium's course when its leaders faltered. They revered the Emperor as a god, like most post-Heresy Marines, and held Rogal Dorn and his ideals in the highest esteem. According to their beliefs, when a Soul Drinker died, his soul would join the Emperor's side in the final battle at the end of time, fighting as part of a legion led by Dorn himself. This almost mystical loyalty to Emperor and Primarch was the bedrock of their identity. By the dawn of the 41st millennium, M41, the Soul Drinkers chapter was stable and respected. Their home base, if it could be called that, was largely fleet-based. They had a range of strike cruisers and battle barges, preferring mobility over a static planet-bound fortress. Their combat doctrine emphasized rapid deployment, Thunderhawk strikes, and brutal close-quarters combat. They specialized in shock and awe tactics, dropping into the heart of an enemy and tearing it out before the foe knew what hit them. If there was a fortress to be stormed or a space hulk infested with Xenos to be cleared, The Soul Drinkers were an excellent choice. However, beneath the surface of all this honor and tradition, the seeds of a tragedy were quietly germinating. The Soul Drinkers did not know it, but something about their chapter's fate was different. Unbeknownst to any outsiders, and even to themselves, there were mysteries in their gene seed and inner circle that would later be revealed. They believed themselves to be pure sons of Dorn, yet that assumption would be challenged. They believed their revered teacher Denyathos had died long ago, a martyr entombed in legend that, too, would prove false in the worst way. For now, though, in early M41, the chapter was confident and forward-looking, proud of their relics, their traditions, and their unblemished service record. It is in this context that we approach the pivotal moment that transformed the Soul Drinkers forever. They were a loyal chapter, perhaps a bit headstrong and idealistic, but nothing one would ever label heretical. They followed the Emperor's will as they saw it, and that dedication would soon be tested in a way none of them expected. The stage was set, the actors in place, an ancient relic, a treacherous ally, and a choice between obedience and righteousness. The Soul Drinkers were about to face a fateful decision that would cast a very long shadow over their future. Little did they know, their proud history of doing the right thing despite the Imperium's flaws was about to repeat itself on a much more personal and catastrophic scale. The curtain rises on the event that begins their descent, the mission to reclaim the Soulspear. Chapter 2: The Soulspear and the Betrayal at Lakonia. For the Soul Drinkers, it all began with a single mission, one that should have been a routine operation and a glorious homecoming for their chapter's lost treasure. That mission was to retrieve the Soulspear, the sacred weapon given to them by Rogal Dorn, which had been lost for centuries. In the early 41st millennium, tantalizing intelligence surfaced. The Soulspear had been spotted in the possession of a criminal cartel operating in the Lakonia system. This cartel, the Van Scorvold cartel, was a notorious syndicate suspected of trafficking in all manner of illegal goods and heretical artifacts. How they got hold of the Soulspear, no one knew, perhaps dug up from some archaeotech black market or pried from a long-lost battlefield. But the news made its way to the Adeptus Administratum. The Imperium's bureaucrats realized the significance and lured the Soul Drinkers in with an appeal to duty and sentiment. Help us take down these mutant-loving criminals, and you can reclaim your chapter's legendary relic. It was an offer the Soul Drinkers could not refuse. Thus, Commander Kaon, one of the chapter's senior officers, was tasked to lead the assault. He brought with him 3 companies of Soul Drinkers, roughly 300 Space Marines, a major deployment of the chapter's strength. It shows how much the Soulspear meant to them that they committed so many to get it back. The operation was planned as a joint effort. The Administratum and local authorities would provide support, namely an Adeptus Mechanicus detachment for tech expertise and heavy firepower, while the Soul Drinkers would do what they do best, storm the fortress and capture the prize. The cartel's base was actually an orbital station, essentially a star fort, or orbital defense platform, orbiting the planet Lakonia 4. This station bristled with weapons and hired soldiers, but 3 companies of Astartes are a force of nature. The assault on the Van Scorvold Star Fort unfolded with rapid brutality. Soul Drinkers drop-podded and boarded the station in coordinated strikes. Commander Kaon led from the front alongside a librarian named Sarpedon, who was attached to the force. The fighting was intense but one-sided. The cartel's mercenaries and pet mutants were swept aside by power armor and bolter fire. In relatively short order, the Marines fought their way to the vault deep in the station where the Soulspear was supposedly kept. Imagine the scene. broken hatchways, smoke-filled corridors echoing with the last gunshots, and the surviving cartel goons trembling as giants in purple armor forced open the sealed vault. Inside, on a display or altar, they would have seen the Soulspear, their Primarch's gift, at long last. One can only imagine the surge of triumph and relief among the soul drinkers. It was as if a piece of their honor lost to time was about to be restored, but triumph turned to betrayal in an eye blink. Just as the soul drinkers secured the vault, there was a sudden burst of light and energy in the chamber teleportation beams. A contingent of Adeptus Mechanicus personnel, who had until then been ostensibly fighting on the Imperium side in the general assault, revealed their true intentions. These tech priests, led by an archmagus named Kobatov, had secretly coveted the Soulspear for themselves. In an instant, the Mechanicus strike team materialized right around the relic, snatched the Soulspear, and teleported away with it before the astonished Space Marines could stop them. To say the Soul Drinkers were shocked would be an understatement. They had fought and bled for this victory. Commander Kaon, perhaps still catching his breath from the battle, suddenly found the objective plucked from his grasp by those who were supposed to be allies. And the betrayal wasn't over, it was just beginning. As alarms blared anew, the station's cogitator screens flickered to life with a message from the Mechanicus vessel in orbit. The Archmagos effectively said, "Thank you for doing the dirty work. The Soulspear is now property of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Stand down and return to your ships, or face consequences." In orbit, the Mechanicus had a warship armed with a fearsome Ordinatus siege cannon, a truly colossal weapon, essentially a gigantic laser or plasma annihilator, typically used for planetary bombardments. Kobaltov trained this cannon on the very station the Marines occupied and threatened to obliterate everyone if the Soul Drinkers did not stand down from pursuing the relic. One can imagine Commander Kaon's fury and disbelief. Space Marines are not accustomed to being stabbed in the back, especially not by fellow servants of the Imperium. The Soul Drinkers considered the Soulspear their holy legacy, and here was the Mechanicus treating them like misbehaving hounds, telling them to roll over while Mars stole their treasure. It was an intolerable insult, an affront to their honor and their chapter's rights. For a moment, perhaps they tried diplomatic protests, arguing that the relic belonged with them, that the Mechanicus should hand it over. But the Archmagos was having none of it. To him, a weapon from the Great Crusade was a piece of archaeotech that the tech priests had the first claim to. The Soul Drinkers were just muscle to help retrieve it. When it became clear that reason and appeals to brotherhood wouldn't work, the Soul Drinkers made a fateful choice. They decided to defy the Mechanicus rather than give up their prize. This right here is a pivotal moment. They could have begrudgingly retreated and filed a complaint through Imperial channels and likely be ignored, but still. Instead, their sense of justice and outrage spurred them to action. In their eyes, they were in the right. The Mechanicus had broken faith, and the Emperor would not want his loyal Astartes cheated out of their relic by some technocrats. You can almost hear Commander Kaon or Librarian Sarpedon growling, "No, we will not surrender what is ours." Given that the Soulspear itself had already been whisked away, teleported to the Mechanicus ship, the Soul Drinkers couldn't grab it back directly, but they could retaliate and ensure the traitors paid a price. They rapidly formulated a counterattack, take out that Ordinatus weapon, and cripple the Mechanicus warship. Using the station's remaining small craft or some boarding torpedoes, Sarpedon led a daring sortie against the Mechanicus vessel. In a cinematic strike, the Soul Drinkers' assault team fought their way onto the Mechanicus ship, headed straight for the giant siege cannon's housing. They had to disable it before it fired and wiped out all of them on the Star Fort. The fighting here pit the Marines against scores of Tech Guard soldiers, cybernetically enhanced Skitarii, and servitors defending the weapon. It was bloody and chaotic. The Soul Drinkers, fueled by righteous anger, slew thousands of the Mechanicus tech thralls in this battle. You can almost imagine a perplexed tech priest thinking, this was not in the mission plan, as a chainsword-wielding Astartes cleaves through his honor guard. Sarpedon, proving his valor and tactical acumen, likely took command on the ground, especially if Kion was dealing with the rest of the force. Amid the carnage, they reached the core of the siege cannon and planted melta charges or other explosives. In a thunderous blast, the Ordinatus weapon was destroyed, rocked by internal explosions that tore through the Mechanicus ship. This was a victory, but a costly and Pyrrhic one. The Soul Drinkers had prevented their immediate destruction, but now they had done the unthinkable. They had shed fellow Imperial blood intentionally. Sure, they felt justified the Mechanicus had betrayed them first, but to outside eyes, Space Marines had just attacked the Adeptus Mechanicus and slaughtered Imperial troops. The scales of loyalty were already tipping precariously. With the siege cannon gone, there was no reason to remain on that orbital station. Commander Kaon ordered demolition charges set on the Star Fort's critical systems. The Soul Drinkers evacuated, and moments later the entire orbital platform was rigged to explode. In a fiery descent visible from Lakonia's surface, the station's wreckage plummeted into the planet's atmosphere, breaking apart and burning like a falling star. Any evidence of what exactly happened up there was reduced to molten slag raining from the sky. The Soul Drinkers' forces regrouped and fled aboard their strike cruisers. But the deed was done. They had openly defied and attacked fellow servants of the Imperium. News traveled fast. The surviving Mechanicus elements and the Administratum officials who orchestrated the mission were not going to keep quiet about this. An Imperial task force that had been present, maybe Navy ships or Arbites craft supporting the operation, was aghast at the sudden turn of events. They quickly rallied to pursue the renegade Astartes. What had begun as a cooperative mission was now a full-blown pursuit of traitors. In the chaos of retreat, tragedy struck the Soul Drinkers' leadership again. Commander Kion was mortally wounded during the confrontation on the Star Fort. Accounts say he was injected with a deadly xenotoxin by Veritas van Scorvold, the cartel lord himself, in a final act of spite before the Soul Drinkers executed that criminal. As Kion lay dying, he used his last breaths to pass command to Librarian Sarpedon, the highest-ranking officer left in the mission group. Think of the gravity of that moment for Sarpedon. One minute he's a librarian captain, serving under a commander. The next he's thrust into overall command of a huge chunk of the chapter in the midst of a crisis. Kaon's dying wish was clear. Retrieve the Soulspear, preserve the chapter's honor. Sarpedon, grim-faced and determined, accepted this burden. Now, leading the escape, Chapter Master-to-be Sarpedon had to outwit and outmaneuver the furious Imperial pursuit. The pursuers, which likely included more Mechanicus ships and possibly Navy vessels, tried to corner the Soul Drinkers. This series of running battles and hide-and-seek across the system is known as the Lakonia persecution. Sarpedon's strike cruisers dashed for cover in the Cerberian field, a dense asteroid belt nearby. The Imperials, wary of taking heavy losses amid the asteroids, settled for blockading the area. They hoped to starve the Soul Drinkers of supplies and force them to surrender. That blockade lasted for 5 long months, a tense standoff with sporadic skirmishes as neither side wanted to plunge fully into the deadly asteroid clusters. During this time, communications must have been flying between various Imperial authorities. What to do about the Soul Drinkers? On the one hand, they clearly had committed violence against fellow Imperials. On the other hand, perhaps someone might have tried to understand their grievance. If any envoys or negotiators attempted to hail Sarpedon, the talks went nowhere. The Soul Drinkers knew they'd been wronged, but the Mechanicus and the Ordo Hereticus cared only that the Astartes had betrayed the Imperium. Sarpedon, for his part, was not about to hand his men over to punishment or relinquish his claim on the Soulspear. Notably, the Soul Drinkers still did not have the Soulspear back. Archmagos Kobatov had sent it away to the Forge World, Codin Tertius, before his ship got wrecked. So Sarpedon likely intended, once free, to chase it down further. From his perspective, their cause was righteous. Retrieve their stolen relic and expose the Mechanicus's treachery. In his heart, Sarpedon probably believed if he could just explain to higher authorities, they'd see the logic. Poor, naive Sarpedon, he underestimated how rigid the Imperium can be with its dogma. The nuance of, they betrayed us first, wasn't about to fly with the Lords of Terra. After months of fruitless blockade, the Imperials escalated. The Ordo Hereticus, the branch of the Inquisition dealing with heresy, sent a heavy hitter to take charge. Lord Inquisitor Gorgotsurus arrived on the scene. Inquisitors typically don't negotiate with those they consider traitors. They issue ultimatums. Tsurus hailed the Soul Drinkers with a blunt demand: surrender and face judgment, or be destroyed. The Inquisition did not care why the Soul Drinkers attacked the Mechanicus. They saw only that an Adeptus Astartes chapter had turned its guns on fellow Imperial servants and defied lawful authority. That, in the eyes of the Inquisition, is heresy and treason, plain and simple. Intentions be damned, the Soul Drinkers had broken the law of Imperial absolute obedience. Sarpedon must have realized at that point that there was no easy way out. If they surrendered, they would likely be executed or mind-wiped for their actions, perhaps even all declared excommunicate traitorous. But Sarpedon's sense of justice rebelled at the notion of yielding to what he felt was a terrible injustice. One imagines a tense communication between Sarpedon and Inquisitor Suras. The Inquisitor probably gave him one last chance to come quietly. Sarpedon, with all due respect, or maybe none at all at this point, refused. He refused to hand himself or his men over, refused to acknowledge wrongdoing in retrieving what was theirs. In effect, he chose the chapter's honor and survival over blind submission to what he considered a corrupt judgment. It was a moment of principled stand and a point of no return. The response was immediate and dire. In moment, the entire Soul Drinkers chapter was declared excommunicate traitorous by the Inquisition. With that seal, they were officially deemed traitors to the Imperium. This is the same level of excommunication that is used on renegade chapters and Chaos Space Marines. It meant any loyal Imperial citizen was obliged to treat the Soul Drinkers as enemies on sight. For a chapter that had been loyal for thousands of years, hearing those words must have been devastating and enraging in equal measure. Loyal heretics, the bitter contradiction of their new existence, was now a reality. As fate would have it, shortly after this declaration, the rest of the Soul Drinkers chapter, the portion not involved in the initial mission, arrived on the scene. Their chapter master, Gorgolion, came with the chapter's fleet, responding to the situation of his embattled companies. Perhaps Gorgolion initially came to extract Kaon's forces, and then learn why the hell his marines were fighting other Imperials. Now, Gorgolion found that half his chapter was in open insurrection. You might think, given what we know about Soul Drinkers' ethos, that Gorgolion would side with his brothers against the outsiders. However, Gorgolion was an orthodox man in many ways. Seeing Sarpedon's forces branded traitors and having attacked the Mechanicus, Gorgolion was furious and appalled. In his eyes, Sarpedon's actions threatened the entire chapter's existence and honor. Gorgolian likely believed they should have obeyed orders, or at least awaited arbitration, rather than resorting to force. So, instead of a joyful relief, the reunion of the chapter led to a confrontation between Gorgolian and Sarpedon. They met perhaps aboard the flagship or on a neutral ground, but there was no bridging the gap. Gorgolion demanded Sarpedon account for his behavior. Sarpedon, equally proud, insisted they were in the right and that the Imperium had betrayed them. If one were a fly on the wall, you might have heard Gorgolion thunder that Sarpedon had damned them all by raising arms against fellow Imperial forces. Sarpedon likely countered that blind obedience to unjust orders was not true loyalty, and that reclaiming the Soulspear was a sacred duty. Two viewpoints clashed, duty to the Imperium's rule versus duty to the Emperor's principles and the chapter's honor. Unsurprisingly, neither yielded. Gorgolion, chapter master and a venerable warrior, could not simply let a subordinate defy Imperial authority and fracture the chapter. For him, the only way to salvage their standing might be to surrender Sarpedon and his rebels to the Inquisition's mercy, such as it would be, and beg for leniency. Sarpedon and those who fought under him were unwilling to throw themselves on the pyre like that. The argument escalated to blows. In a way befitting Space Marine honor, the two decided the fate of the chapter in single combat, an honor duel between chapter master and librarian-turned-renegade leader. The fight between Gorgolion and Sarpedon was fierce and symbolic. Gorgolion was a seasoned veteran in artificer armor, perhaps wielding a mighty thunder hammer or power sword. Sarpedon was a formidable psyker and warrior, but younger, and crucially, he bore an unusual advantage. Sometime during or after the Lakonia events, Sarpedon had begun to manifest a strange mutation. The warp exposure and his psychic nature led to him growing an extra pair of limbs, actually. 4 extra limbs, arachnid-like legs sprouting from his torso. Yes, Sarpedon was mutating into a spider-like form, a physical mark of chaos influence, though he believed it a test or curse rather than a gift. This mutation initially horrified many of his fellow Marines, and some questioned whether Sarpedon was tainted. But others took it as a sign or simply did not care as long as he led them well. In the duel, Sarpedon's mutation proved decisive. His spider-like legs granted him speed, agility, and extra weapons in melee. Gorgolion fought powerfully, but Sarpedon's warp-fueled might and freakish agility allowed him to overcome the chapter master. In a dramatic moment, Sarpedon struck Gorgolion down. Whether he intended a killing blow or just incapacitation, accounts vary, but Gorgolion did die from this confrontation. By the chapter's own warrior code, that meant Sarpedon had claimed victory and, effectively, leadership. But instead of a glorious transfer of power, this event ignited a full-blown civil war within the chapter. Many of the soul drinkers could not accept what they just saw. To them, Sarpedon killing the chapter master, and doing it while sporting a clearly unholy mutation, was proof that Sarpedon's side was sliding into damnation. Most of these dissenters were the chapter's novices, newer initiates, and a portion of more traditionalist brethren who had arrived with Gorgolion. They barricaded themselves on ships and sections of the fleet, refusing to follow Sarpedon. On the other hand, Sarpedon had the loyalty of nearly all the veterans who had fought under him through the recent battles, including experienced sergeants, specialists like Apothecary Pallas, at that moment still loyal to Sarp, and possibly a few company captains. The chapter's librarius, many of its tech marines, and other officers sided with Sarpedon as well. Essentially, the chapter split into 2 camps, those loyal to Sarpedon's vision, who believed the Imperium had failed them and that they must chart their own course, and those loyal to the Imperium's judgment, who saw Sarpedon as leading them into true heresy. What followed was a grim internecine conflict remembered as the First Chapter War of the Soul Drinkers, a battle within the fleet itself, deck by deck, ship by ship. This was no mere training scuffle. It was a fight to the death for the soul of the chapter. Sarpedon's loyalists hunted down the insurrectionist novices wherever they dug in. The novices, for their part, fought ferociously, refusing to yield. Space Marines are deadly opponents even to one another, and they knew each other's tactics intimately. For several months, the fleet was a charnel house of brother-on-brother violence. Boarding actions were launched within their own vessels. Betrayals occurred in microcosm. A squad that once fought shoulder to shoulder might split apart in a corridor, one half shouting, "For Sarpedon!" and the other, "For the chapter's soul," before bolter fire cut them both down. There are a few particularly tragic footnotes from this internal war. Captain Karayedin, a veteran who had supported Sarpedon's defiance of the Imperium, was made Master of Novices, in charge of scout and new recruit training. Ironically, when the novices rebelled, Karayedin tried to reason with them, and they killed him, their own mentor, in the opening moves of the mutiny. It was that kind of conflict, friends and students turning on leaders if their loyalties differed. Apothecary Palace, meanwhile, remained with Sarpedon through this First Chapter war. He would have his doubts later, but right now he was invested in helping his brothers, mutated or not. Ultimately, Sarpedon prevailed. His forces, comprised of most Terminators, veterans, librarians, and other specialists, systematically crushed the rebel elements. It took a long and bloody effort, several months to root them out and kill them all, as one account puts it. By the end, the dissenters were annihilated to the last man. The cost was horrific. The chapter killed a significant fraction of its own. When the purge was done, the Soul Drinkers chapter was a shadow of its former self in numbers, but at least now unified under Sarpedon's leadership. Sarpedon assumed the title of Chapter Master, though what that meant now, outside Imperial law, was debatable. If the Imperium had hopes of the Soul Drinkers tearing themselves apart, Sarpedon dashed that by emerging victorious and in full control. The surviving Marines were those who accepted Sarpedon's vision. They had broken with the Imperium's authority, but they still believed they were loyal to the Emperor and doing what was right. They were now, effectively, a renegade chapter cut off from supply lines, declared traitors, but not servants of chaos or the like. In fact, at this stage, they despised the idea of turning to chaos. They saw themselves as true servants of the Emperor betrayed by corrupt Imperial institutions. Sarpedon's guiding mantra became something like, "The Imperium is rotten and no longer represents the Emperor's will. We, the Soul Drinkers, will carry out the Emperor's will on our own, free of that corruption." It was a bold, dangerous mindset, one that put them in permanent collision course with official Imperial forces. Having settled matters internally, Sarpedon now had to ensure the chapter's survival in a hostile galaxy. The Soul Drinkers were essentially on their own. They had no homeworld, being fleet-based, and now no safe ports of call. If they tried to dock at any Imperial planet or starport, they'd be met with a hail of defensive fire. They also knew the Inquisition and perhaps Space Marine chapters like the Crimson Fists would be hunting them relentlessly. So Sarpedon made a strategic decision: they would disappear. To that end, he had the remainder of the chapter's warships, those not needed for basic conveyance, scuttled, self-destructed. He wasn't going to fight a big fleet action against the Imperium's navies. That was a losing proposition. Instead, they would become drifters, hard to track. The key to this plan was a colossal space hulk they had discovered, a conglomeration of wrecked ships fused by warp energies, floating in the void. This hulk was known as Brokenback. The Soul Drinkers moved on to Brokenback and made it their mobile fortress monastery. It was shielded from easy detection by its massive size and warp signature, and it could move unpredictably through space, as space hulks sometimes do when they slip in and out of warp. By hiding in this dark, labyrinthine vessel, the Soul Drinkers gained a hidden base from which to operate. They became essentially an underground resistance force on a chapter scale, lurking at the galaxy's fringes. To cement their path, Sarpedon and his followers had effectively rejected the Imperium, but not the Emperor. They would continue to conduct themselves as Space Marines fighting humanity's enemies, but would treat any Imperial forces that attempted to apprehend them as hostile. This is the central irony that would define them. By acting according to their own conscience and loyalty to the Emperor's ideals, they were now considered traitors to the very Imperium he built. However, one might ask, what about the influence of chaos? Surely a chapter that just went rogue and had some mutants in their ranks would be a prime target for the Dark Gods. Indeed, the Soul Drinkers' entry into exile did not go unnoticed by the powers of chaos. In fact, one was directly orchestrating things from behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to Sarpedon, the strange visions and inner voice that had guided him during the Soulspear mission were not divine inspiration from the Emperor as he had believed. That guiding voice belonged to the demon prince Abraxas, a powerful servant of the chaos god Tzeentch, the changer of ways. Abraxas, cunning and patient, had masqueraded as an architect of fate, a very Tzeentchian title, claiming to be a manifestation of the Emperor's will. Recall that during the Van Scorvold Star Fort assault, a mysterious prisoner named Iser helped Sarpedon by revealing a hidden hangar and claiming he had visions from the Emperor's aspect, choosing Sarpedon as his instrument. That was Abraxas' handiwork, planting the seed that Sarpedon was special, perhaps even justified in defying normal rules because a higher destiny awaited him. It was subtle and devilishly effective. Sarpedon followed this Emperor's chosen narrative, and it emboldened him to break with the Imperium's chain of command. In truth, Abraxas was grooming the chapter for a fall, hoping to turn them into his pawns. Now that the Soul Drinkers were isolated and on the run, Abraxas made his next move. He approached Sarpedon in disguise, possibly as a psychic vision of a golden figure or some guiding whisper during deep meditation. And Abraxas began to direct the Soul Drinkers' actions, still claiming to be the Emperor or a servant of the Emperor guiding them. Not long after they settled into the broken-back space hulk, Sarpedon received what he thought was divine guidance to strike at a certain foe of the Emperor. This foe was actually one of Abraxas' rivals, a Nurgle-aligned demon prince, or demon-possessed entity, named Vemeth. Vemeth had infested an entire planet, turning into a sort of sentient supervirus that controlled the population, a grotesque manifestation of Nurgle's plagues. To Sarpedon, hitting a Nurgle monster certainly sounded like something the Emperor would want, and it was a chance to do some unequivocal good even while in exile. The Soul Drinkers, hungry to keep fighting for righteous causes, took the bait. They launched an assault on Vemeth's stronghold, which one source suggests might have been a planet where Vemeth literally was the disease. The battle was nightmarish. The Marines faced swarms of plague zombies and had to burn whole hordes of infected. But eventually they cornered Vemeth's core, maybe a bloated demon host or a central viral node. Vemeth was destroyed by the Soul Drinkers, an act that, unbeknownst to them, eliminated a thorn in Abraxas' eye. As the foul Nurgle creature perished, the Tzeentchian puppet master dropped his charade. Abraxas himself manifested before Sarpedon, revealing his true form, a demon prince of Tzeentch, cackling at the success of his manipulation. In that dramatic moment, Abrixes offered the Soul Drinkers exactly what one might expect a demon to offer: betrayed, outcast warriors, power, and a place at his side. He extended Sarpedon the opportunity to serve him as Chaos Space Marines, to be his personal warband in the long war against the Imperium. Abrixes was likely confident after all. He had orchestrated their break from the Imperium, watched them fall to internal strife and mutation, and now saved them from a Nurgle threat. Surely they were ripe for the taking. Sarpedon's response? No, in the name of the Emperor. If Abrixes expected the Soul Drinkers to kneel, he gravely miscalculated their character. Sarpedon, whatever else one might say about his choices, was utterly devoted to the Emperor's ideal. Accepting the patronage of a chaos demon was anathema to him. In fact, that reveal likely enraged Sarpedon. He realized that this architect of fate that he thought was the Emperor's voice was actually a manipulator from the warp. It meant that some of the steps he took, possibly even the rebellion, had been guided by a ruinous power's agenda. One imagines Sarpedon's blood boiling at the thought that Chaos had a hand in corrupting their destiny. Thus, instead of bowing, the Soul Drinkers attacked Abrixes and his daemonic minions right then and there. A vicious skirmish unfolded, and miraculously, the enraged loyalist heretics managed to drive Abraxas off. Perhaps they didn't destroy him. Banishing a demon prince permanently is no small feat. But they certainly refused his offer and made it clear he was not welcome. Abraxas' plan, to convert them, failed spectacularly. Before he vanished back into the warp, however, Abraxas did one last thing. He mockingly returned the Soulspear to Sarpedon. Yes, that very relic which started this whole mess. It appears that in the shadows, Abraxas' agents, or perhaps the Van Scorvold prisoner, Iser was one, had ensured the Soulspear ended up in his claws. By handing the Soulspear over now, Abraxas as much as said, "Here, have what you wanted and see where it got you." It was a spiteful parting gift. Sarpedon took up the Soulspear at last, but surely with bitter feelings. This weapon of Dorn was meant to be a symbol of unity and purpose, yet the quest for it had led them into damnation's grip. Still, Sarpedon may have also seen it as a sign. If the Emperor didn't abandon them entirely, maybe it was symbolically returned so they could yet fulfill some purpose. After Abraxas' departure, the Soul Drinkers were left in a precarious situation. They had severed ties with the Imperium, and now they'd violently rejected Chaos's temptation too. They were truly alone renegades in the gray area, belonging neither to the Emperor's domain nor the Dark Gods. Not many in the galaxy occupy that perilous middle ground for long and live. However, one immediate problem seemed solved. The chapter's rampant mutations that had begun manifesting, like Sarpedon's spider legs and others developing weird changes, could possibly be cured or halted now. The Soul Drinkers realized that Abraxas' influence was the cause of their mutation's exposure to his warp trickery had tainted them. And if Abraxas could be foiled, perhaps the mutations could be managed. This became the next urgent goal: find a cure, or at least stop the spread of these mutations before the chapter degenerated into chaos spawn. It was around this time that Apothecary Pallas stepped up with a plan. Pallas was the chief apothecary, essentially the gene seed and medical specialist of the chapter. He knew of a place called Stratix Lumine, a desolate planetoid where decades or centuries before, the Soul Drinkers had once fought alongside or for the Adeptus Mechanicus. In that old campaign, the chapter had saved a Mechanicus research outpost and apparently left it intact. Pallas recalled that the Mechanicus there had been conducting experiments in human mutation, the morally dubious sort of science the Mechanicus sometimes does in secret. Stratix Luminae might hold data or samples useful to reverse or stabilize genetic aberrations. Additionally, Tzeentch's puppet Tesseract, remember him, had also operated around Stratix, which meant there might be even more pertinent research left over. Thus began the quest of the Soul Drinkers to cure their curse, a journey that would take them back into the line of fire of both Imperial vengeance and new heretical enemies. Chapter 3: The Quest for Redemption. Tesseract's Plague and the Bleeding Chalice. The Soul Drinkers set course for the worlds under the sway of Tesseract, a name that was becoming infamous on the fringes. Tesseract was a powerful heretic warlord, not a chaos space marine, but something arguably stranger. According to fragmented Mechanicus records, Tesseract was the result of grotesque Adeptus Mechanicus experiments on Stratix Luminae. They had tried to create some kind of warp-mutated human, and boy, did they succeed too well. Tesseract had become a living nexus of disease and death, essentially a walking, or maybe hovering, plague psyker who could exude viruses that controlled minds and even reanimated the dead. In the power vacuum of that region, Tesseract had carved out a little empire by conquering several planets using his zombie plague armies and mind-controlled cultists. He was worshipped as a living god by those he enthralled, a fitting little god of decay and despair. While any sane Imperial citizen would run away from such a nightmare, the Soul Drinkers ran toward it. They had two motivations: pragmatic, to get the genetic research data to stop their own mutations, and penitential, to prove, perhaps to themselves, that they were still on the Emperor's side by taking down a major chaos-worshipping threat. They might have been renegades, but they would show they still hated the real heretics. However, remember that the Soul Drinkers were being hunted. As they began infiltrating Tesseract's war zone, an inquisitorial task force led by the persistent Inquisitor Thaddeus was never far behind. Thaddeus had made it something of a personal mission to catch the Soul Drinkers, pursuing them doggedly across systems. He utilized all tools at his disposal: spies, informants, local Imperial garrisons, and kill teams. The Soul Drinkers had to stay ahead of him while simultaneously poking around plague-infested worlds for clues. It was a grim race. The first order of business was to gather intelligence. Sarpedon dispatched squads to quietly land on several worlds under Tesseract's shadow, where pockets of resistance or survivors might still exist. Over multiple skirmishes, the Soul Drinkers captured or contacted Mechanicus personnel who had fled Stratix or survived the initial takeovers. These tech priests and scientists, once convinced the giant purple warriors wouldn't execute them, imagine their confusion. Renegade Marines, showing up to help them rather than kill them, provided bits of the puzzle. Piece by piece, the chapter learned what exactly had been on Stratix Luminae. Research data on mutation, gene samples, possibly even tools to reverse warp-spawned genetic changes. Pallas grew increasingly certain that if they could just reach the facility on Stratix and retrieve those samples, he could concoct a treatment to arrest the mutations afflicting the Brethren. It was a ray of hope for the embattled chapter. Of course, Tesseract didn't sit idle while intruders mucked about his domain. The warlord had countless eyes among the infected, and he also commanded a space fleet of plague-ridden hulks. As the Soul Drinkers struck at his holdings, Tesseract took notice. If one were imaginative, one could picture this grotesque being in orbit above some conquered hive world, communing with the hive mind of his virus, sensing the clean life forces of Astartes cutting through his filth in various places. It enraged him. This upstart warlord decided to make an example of these meddlers. When the Soul Drinkers finally made planetfall on Stratix Luminae itself, Tesseract sprung a trap. Stratix Luminae was a bleak gray world pockmarked with abandoned labs and vaults, since most Mechanicus staff died or fled when Tesseract rose. As Sarpedon's strike force was securing the research facility they came for, Tesseract himself arrived in orbit. But rather than deploy armies conventionally, he did something dramatic. He blew up his own capital ship in the sky above Stratix. The massive vessel, likely a plague-infested battleship, fragmented in a controlled detonation, not to annihilate the planet, but to create countless pieces of falling debris. And not just debris. Within each chunk of wreckage were hundreds of Tesseract's undead followers, falling through the atmosphere like diseased meteors. It was a literal plague rain of zombies. Entire sections of the warship plummeted, broke apart on re-entry, and showered the Soul Drinkers area with twisted metal and a flood of undead that survived the fall, supernaturally resilient as the virus puppeted their shattered bodies onward. On the ground, spires and hab blocks toppled from the impacts, and the sky turned orange with fire. The Soul Drinkers suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against an instant army of the undead rising from the smoldering wreckage around them. This was exactly the kind of desperate battle Space Marines excel at. The Soul Drinkers formed defensive perimeters and went at it with bolter, blade, and flamer. Brothers who moments ago were carefully packing data cores and gene vials now stood shoulder to shoulder incinerating hordes of plague zombies. To make matters worse, the psychic pressure of Tesseract's presence began to weigh on them. Some weaker-willed humans in their vicinity, perhaps any remaining Mechanicus personnel helping them, started succumbing to mind control, turning on the Marines from within. It was chaos in the truest sense. At this juncture, Inquisitor Thaddeus finally caught up as well. If the Soul Drinkers hoped for a little slack given the situation, they were mistaken, but Thaddeus was a complex man. He arrived on Stratix Luminae in force, perhaps with a retinue of stormtroopers or even a detachment of Tempestus Scions, expecting to corner Sarpedon. Instead, he found a war zone of plague and undead, with the renegade Marines ironically locked in battle against the forces of chaos. Thaddeus was nothing if not pragmatic. He realized if Tesseract wasn't stopped here, it wouldn't matter if the Soul Drinkers were captured, the plague would spread further. So, in the midst of this three-way melee, Thaddeus temporarily allied himself with Sarpedon's forces against Tesseract. It must have been a strange sight. An Inquisitor fighting alongside excommunicated Marines he had chased across the sector. But the dire circumstances left little choice. Together, they pushed toward the center of Tesseract's power on the planet. Tesseract himself descended into the ruins, perhaps carried on a palanquin of fused corpses or swirling in a cloud of flies. He was no easy foe, massive, bloated, radiating psychic disease. One account describes Sarpedon confronting Tesseract directly. The librarian turned chapter master reached out with his own psychic ability, which he called the Hell, a talent for inducing extreme agony or fear via telepathy, and stunned Tesseract, momentarily neutralizing the monster's mind-controlling aura. Taking advantage of that opening, Inquisitor Thaddeus leveled his firearm, maybe a sanctified bolt pistol or plasma gun, and blasted Tesseract at close range. The wounded Plague Lord reeled, his ichor spilling. Sarpedon then rushed in to finish it, with a thrust of his Force staff, or maybe the Soulspear itself, if he was wielding it by then. He struck Tesseract down and psychically extinguished the Heretic's soul. In a flare of light and a wash of disorienting warp stench, Tesseract was no more. The towering hulk of his mutated body collapsed, and the control he had on his empire collapsed with him. The hordes of undead fell lifeless. The contagion lost its guiding will. The battle was won thanks in part to a most unlikely team-up. So there we had it, the Soul Drinkers and an Inquisitor fighting side by side to destroy a champion of Nurgle. If things were simpler, one might think, great, now Thaddeus will pardon them, seeing their true loyalty. But the grim reality of the Imperium isn't so forgiving. When the dust settled, Thaddeus and Sarpedon had a tense standoff. The Inquisitor breathing heavily amid the piles of corpses and smoldering ruin, likely fixed Sarpedon with a hard stare. He had seen these Marines do the Emperor's work today, but he could not ignore that they were officially outlaws who had killed loyal folk as well. Perhaps in that moment Thaddeus was even conflicted, but duty is duty. He signaled his retinue, probably intending to finally arrest or execute the Soul Drinkers now that their mutual foe was gone. Sarpedon was having none of that. The Soul Drinkers had obtained what they came for, the genetic cure data from Stratix's facility, and had neutralized the big evil. They weren't about to surrender to the very authority that betrayed and hunted them. As Imperial reinforcements closed in, Sarpedon ordered a withdrawal. A brief, sharp skirmish might have erupted between Soul Drinker Marines and Thaddeus's henchmen as each side pulled apart. Knowing the terrain and using their dropship mobility, the Soul Drinkers managed to slip away from Thaddeus's attempt to contain them. Perhaps Thaddeus let them go intentionally, considering they had just saved his life in that battle, or perhaps he simply couldn't stop them in time, wounded and with his forces depleted. Either way, the Soul Drinkers escaped Stratix Lumini with their prize. Apothecary Pallas got to work using the recovered research to treat his brothers. Over the following weeks, he was able to halt the progression of the mutations. Those who had grown extra limbs or other oddities didn't necessarily revert, but further corruption was stopped and new mutations ceased appearing among the ranks. For example, Sarpedon kept his spider legs, but at least he wasn't sprouting more or turning into a chaos spawn. The chapter breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had quite literally cut out the infection, both metaphorically in removing chaos influence and literally in stabilizing gene seed. The success on Stratix Lumine was a high point for Sarpedon's leadership. It proved to his followers that, renegades or not, they could still achieve noble goals. They saved many Imperial worlds by toppling Tetrarach's mini-empire, though likely the Imperium at large would never credit them for it, and they remained free to continue their mission. However, it had come at the cost of leaving some of their own behind. The sacrifice of Sergeant Telos and his assault squads at Stratix still lingered as an unresolved thread, one that fate would soon tug on, leading to one of the most emotional chapters in the Soul Drinkers saga. Chapter 4: Blood and Heresy on Entymion 4. The aftermath of the Stratix Lumini campaign left the Soul Drinkers physically cured of mutation, but not without scars. The most painful wound was the loss of Sergeant Telos and his assault marines, who had been left behind during the frantic evacuation of Stratix. Let's revisit that grim decision. When Tetrarach's forces had swarmed Stratix and the Soul Drinkers had to escape, some squads had volunteered, or been ordered, to hold off the enemy to buy time. Sergeant Telos, a hot-blooded and zealous assault squad leader, was among those who bravely covered the withdrawal. Sarpedon faced an agonizing choice: linger to rescue them and risk annihilation of everyone, or depart and hope those left behind could fend for themselves. Duty required him to cut them loose, and so he did. The gunships blasted off under fire, leaving Telos and dozens of battle brothers on the ground amidst a tidal wave of undead and frenzied cultists. No Marine easily forgives being abandoned. For Telos, already known to struggle with his temper and an almost berserker ferocity, this felt like betrayal. He had fought loyally through all the recent trials, watched his chapter fracture and mutate and pull back together, only to be thrown to the wolves. As the extraction shuttles roared into the sky without him, something snapped in Telos. To be fair, it's possible no one could have survived that situation with sanity intact. His men likely fell one by one, torn apart by plague zombies, and Telos himself may have been grievously injured. He had always been a warrior who walked the line of cornate rage. His battle fury was legendary and troubling even before. Now, left for dead by those he trusted, he tipped over the edge. Whether out of a pure will to survive at any cost, or out of spite against his chapter, Telos and a handful of surviving assault marines made a dark pact. Facing certain death, they turned to the one power that might grant them strength to claw out of that nightmare: chaos. Specifically, the blood god Khorne, who values rage, martial prowess, and has no issue with betrayal so long as the skulls flow. In that desperate hour, Telos yielded to the whispers of the blood god that had likely been circling his mind in every battle. His already formidable strength and rage were amplified by the ruinous power. Any moral compunction he had was drowned in the promise of vengeance and endless war. Thus was born a new Chaos warband, albeit a small one. Telos and his fellow abandoned assault marines rebranded themselves, perhaps not formally at first, but in spirit, as servants of Khorne. They likely slaughtered their way off Stratix, maybe finding a heretic ship to hitch a ride on amidst the chaos, and started carving out their own bloody path in the galaxy. Importantly, in Telos's mind, the Soul Drinkers chapter, especially Sarpedon, were now as much enemies as any Imperial or Xenos. In fact, worse, they were Oathbreakers who had left him to die. It wasn't long before Sarpedon learned of this tragic development. The Soul Drinkers still maintained astropathic ears and a spy network from allies or freed worlds. They caught word of a band of purple-armored Astartes wreaking havoc. But these Marines were different. They were said to be madmen drenched in blood, roaring praises to the dark gods, and led by a warrior who still wore the colors of the Soul Drinkers, but had dedicated himself to Khorne. The renegade loyalists' hearts collectively sank at this news. One of their own had truly fallen to chaos. That stung far more than any label the Imperium slapped on them. They had tried so hard to remain uncorrupted, to chart an honorable path in dishonor, and now, due to their own actions, leaving Telos, a brother was lost to actual heresy. Sarpedon took it personally. Telos had been a trusted sergeant, one of the chapter's fierce swords, and now his rage was the Imperium's nightmare to bear. Sarpedon vowed to either bring Telos back to the Emperor's light or, if that was impossible, put him down. It was a somber resolution, but necessary. He could not allow a Khorne-crazed warband to tarnish what little moral high ground the Soul Drinkers claimed. If the Imperium learned that some Soul Drinkers turned to chaos, they'd assume all had, and indeed many in the Imperium already thought that was the case. For the sake of the chapter's soul, and perhaps out of guilt and love for his lost brethren, Sarpedon mobilized his forces for a new mission: find and deal with Telos. Tracking Telos's warband, which some rumors called the Black Chalice, or other grim moniker, led the Soul Drinkers to the planet Entymion 4. Entymion 4 was an agri-world, peaceful fields and pastures once, now transformed into a hellscape by a convergence of terrible forces. By ill luck, or malevolent design of the Chaos Gods, who love a good convergence, Entymion 4 had become host to a three-way conflict. Telos's warband of ex-Soul Drinkers turned Khorne berserkers had made planetfall, likely seeking slaughter for its own sake. A Slaneshi chaos cult had also risen on the planet, possibly with the involvement of some very unlikely allies, a Drukhari cabal known as the Burning Scale. Normally, Dark Eldar, Drukhari, don't worship Slanesh. They hate she who thirsts. So it's more likely the Drukhari were exploiting the Slaneshi cult in some way, perhaps using the cultists as cattle for pain and souls. Or maybe this was a twisted scenario where pleasure cultists and sadistic Xenos found common cause temporarily. In any event, the presence of Dark Eldar and a Slanesh-worshipping human faction made for a depraved and chaotic occupation of the world's capital city. The Imperium wasn't sitting idle either. Imperial Guard regiments had been deployed to liberate Entymion 4, and they had requested Astartes' assistance. Responding to that call was a detachment of the Crimson Fist's Space Marines, about one company's worth, led by Captain Rhaenys, the very same who had a bone to pick with the Soul Drinkers from earlier encounters. When the Soul Drinkers arrived in Entymion 4's vicinity, they found a full war already underway. The Imperial Guard was battling through the planet's main continent, city by city, against a bizarre alliance of the Drukhari and Chaos cultists. The Drukhari probably manipulated the cult to cause maximum mayhem. Meanwhile, the Crimson Fists had landed in spearhead fashion to strike at the enemy leadership. It's here that fate thrust Rhaenys and Sarpedon onto intersecting paths again. Captain Rhaenys, a proud and honorable Crimson Fist, had been humiliated by the Soul Drinkers previously. Recall that on some prior battlefield, some sources say it was on Entymion 4 itself, as if this planet's cursed fate entangled them from the start. Rhaenys had lost his company's standard, banner, to the Soul Drinkers in combat. For a Space Marine captain, that's an immense dishonor. The Soul Drinkers had literally captured the flag, a symbolic victory that gnawed at Rhaenys' soul, so much so that Rhaenys had relinquished his command afterward to take on a sort of penitential quest, the warrior's pilgrimage, to redeem himself. And oh, did he hunger for a chance to square accounts with Sarpedon's traitors. Now, on Entymion 4, Rhaenys was theoretically there to fight Xenos and Slaneshi heretics. But when he saw signs of Soul Drinkers active on the planet, his focus shifted. At first, he likely assumed these were the renegade loyalist Soul Drinkers under Sarpedon. But in truth, it was Telos's berserkers causing the carnage. From Rhaenys' perspective, though, traitor Marines are traitor Marines. He immediately sent word via Astropath back to Rin's world. Soul Drinkers are present, send reinforcements to crush them. The Crimson Fists chapter master, glad to see Rhaenys so eager to wipe the stain from his honor, dispatched Chaplain Inhuaka with the second company to support him. Rhaenys, though technically on a penitent detached duty, effectively regained command of a sizable force with a single goal: kill or capture Chief Librarian Sarpedon's head, as their orders explicitly stated. While the Crimson Fists geared up for a grudge match, the Soul Drinkers quietly inserted themselves onto the planet via hijacked civilian landers, subtle moves to avoid drawing attention from both the Guard and Fists. However, subtlety evaporated soon. The moment the Soul Drinkers team touched down, the Crimson Fists got wind. Their Auspex scanning probably flagged unauthorized dropships. Rhaenys realized the Soul Drinkers were exactly where he suspected and moved to engage. The initial meeting between Soul Drinkers and Crimson Fists on Entymion 4 was an ugly, confusing melee in the ruins of the capital city Gravenhold. Sarpedon's aim was to locate Telos. Rhaenys' aim was to kill Sarpedon, and Telos' aim was to kill anything breathing. Add to that the Drukhari sniping from shadowy spires and Slaneshi cultists springing ambushes with ecstatic shrieks, and you have a complete pandemonium. During one early clash, Rhaenys' advance force encountered Telos' berserkers at an ancient cathedral square. The fighting was fierce and inconclusive. The Khorne Marines gave as good as they got. Amid the chaos, the Crimson Fists glimpsed those familiar chalice symbols and purple armor, confirming in their minds that the Soul Drinkers were indeed here in force. They couldn't distinguish that these were corrupted exiles versus Sarpedon's main group. To them, all wore the same colors. The Soul Drinkers, for their part, had an advantage in the city. Their scouts fanned out to gather intel. They soon pinpointed Telos' general location by tracking surges of violence, as one might imagine following the trail of eviscerated bodies and cratered war zones leads right to Telos. Meanwhile, Sarpedon had to deal with being hunted by loyalist Astartes at the same time. He saw the bigger picture. The Drukhari and cultists were trying to turn Entymion 4 into something horrific. In fact, evidence emerged that the Dark Eldar had a grand, sinister plan. Beneath Gravenhold, the Xenos had a network of labs and pens where they were mutating human slaves en masse, prepping an army of grotesque abominations. Their goal: to unleash a slaughter of such epic proportions, a literal mass sacrificial massacre that the sheer agony and bloodshed would elevate Entymion 4 to a demon world aligned with Slaanesh. Essentially, they wanted to tear open reality and create their own little hell realm, with themselves in charge, of course. If that happened, the entire region would produce a Slaaneshi warp rift and be lost permanently, not to mention empower Slaanesh. The Soul Drinkers discovered this scheme, likely through capturing some cult leader or interrogating a Drukhari, though the latter is a tall order. Sarpedon realized that, ironically, the Soul Drinkers were the only ones who both knew of the plan and could move freely to stop it. He had to act fast to foil the Dark Eldar's apocalyptic design, all while still trying to rein in Telos and avoid being hammered by Crimson Fists. A daunting juggling act, but Sarpedon was a master of multitasking chaos by now. In a risky move, Sarpedon feigned an alliance with the Dark Eldar. Yes, the Soul Drinkers approached the Drukhari leaders under a flag of truce, apparently proposing some cooperation. Both sides were treacherous by nature. The Drukhari live for backstabbing, and the Soul Drinkers were desperate pragmatists at this point. So it was like two serpents dancing around. The Dark Eldar Archon figured he could use the Soul Drinkers to hold off the Imperial forces longer, or sacrifice them later. Sarpedon figured he'd get close enough to stab the Archon in the back at the right time. Thus, Sarpedon agreed to help the Drukhari blunt the Imperial Guard and Crimson Fist's attacks, in exchange for some assistance locating Telos. The Dark Eldar, likely amused at the thought of Space Marines turning on other Space Marines, provided Sarpedon with information. They pointed him to where Telos' warband was slaughtering an Imperial Guard regiment. Good Sarpedon's primary target was illuminated. In return, Sarpedon split his forces. Part of the Soul Drinkers indeed went to hit some guard positions, fulfilling his side of the bargain superficially, and to draw away the Crimson Fist's attention, while his core team made beeline toward Telos. A brutal three-way battle erupted in Gravenhold's main trade district when Sarpedon's group caught up to Telos. There, the Soul Drinker scouts finally pinned Telos' exact position. On a span bridge, an elevated highway or viaduct in the city, now strewn with the corpses of guardsmen. Telos and his frenzied brothers were literally mid-bloodbath, chopping through a beleaguered guard-armored company. Chaplain Iktinos, still loyal to Sarpedon at this point, led a vanguard that charged in to intercept Telos' squad. Iktinos and his flock, the term given to his close followers in the chapter, engaged the Khornat Marines, trying to contain them in place. It was a clash of former brothers. chainswords clashing with chain axes, oaths to Horn shouted back by prayers to the Emperor. Iktinos was able to stall Telos effectively, likely through fervor and skill. This gave time for Sarpedon himself to arrive. The confrontation between Sarpedon and Telos was as tragic as it was violent. Telos, now more beast than man, likely hurled accusations of betrayal. "You left us to die, and now you die," sort of rage. Sarpedon would have tried to reach any humanity left in Telos. Maybe he shouted, "Brother, stand down. Remember the Emperor." But nothing remained except hate, so the two fought. Sarpedon, wielding perhaps his Force Staff or Soulspear, against Telos with twin lightning claws or roaring chain axes. The duel crashed through the bridge amid explosions and bolter fire from others. Ultimately, Sarpedon proved victorious. In a cunning move, he detonated charges, or shot out supports, that collapsed a section of the span bridge, dropping tons of masonry and debris onto Telos. The Berserker was literally buried under a mountain of rubble. Sarpedon and his marines, thinking that had finished him, withdrew from the scene, mission accomplished as far as they could manage. The Dark Eldar got what they wanted. Imperial forces thrown into chaos a bit longer, giving them more time, and the Soul Drinkers eliminated the immediate Khorne threat. So they believed. They planned to regroup and focus on the Xenos next. Unbeknownst to Sarpedon, Telos survived his apparent demise. Khorne's favor, and likely the superhuman durability of a space marine, allowed him to claw out of the wreckage with grievous wounds but alive. However, his warband was decimated and scattered. Before Telos could seek revenge or rejoin the fray, fate intervened. At this point, the Inquisition, frustrated with Entymion IV's situation, decided to cut losses. Inquisitor Ahinobarbus, an Ordo Hereticus agent accompanying the Guard, decided that the contamination of the planet was too severe. Between a Slanesh warp gate attempt, Xenos, and Chaos Marines, you can see his point, the order was given to enact exterminatus on Entymion IV. As the remaining Imperial forces evacuated orbit, a barrage of cyclonic torpedoes rained down. The entire planet's surface was engulfed in flame. The Dark Eldar's budding demon world was snuffed out in nuclear fire before it could fully manifest. Any surviving cultists or mutated slaves were purged in the Holocaust. The Crimson Fists had to hurriedly get out too, and they were bitter they lost many good men and the chance to finish off Sarpedon. Telos, crawling free only to see an apocalyptic firestorm rushing toward him, met his end in that hellfire, a fittingly over-the-top death for a Khornate villain. Entymion IV was cleansed, albeit at the ultimate cost, rendered a lifeless, tainted cinder. The Soul Drinkers, luckily, had managed to escape in time as well, but not without casualties. Importantly, they had eliminated Telos's warband and foiled the Dark Eldar's Demon World plot, though they didn't get thanks for it. However, this campaign took a toll on their already reduced numbers. Worse, the Crimson Fists and other Imperial observers now fully conflated the Soul Drinkers with outright Chaos Space Marines due to the chaotic nature of that conflict. Rhaenys, whose personal vendetta had only partially been sated, felt robbed of final justice when the Inquisition destroyed everything. But his hatred of the Soul Drinkers was now probably greater than ever, especially since they tricked the Loyalists and allied with Xenos, however briefly. One can be certain Rhaenys told any High Lords or Chapter Masters who would listen that the Soul Drinkers had undeniably committed heresy and needed eradication. From the Soul Drinkers' perspective, Entymion IV was a Pyrrhic victory. They dealt with the immediate shame of Telos's defection, but at heavy cost and further cementing their reputation as heretics in Imperial eyes. Sarpedon's leadership once again guided them through a morally gray situation he had manipulated and been manipulated, and only quick thinking prevented total disaster. Still, he and his chapter had so far survived everything thrown at them: betrayal, civil war, mutation, demonic trickery, internal coup, Xenos schemes, and a vengeful Inquisition. One might say they were running on fumes, though. Each fight saw fewer of their number stand back up. And in the shadows, unbeknownst to Sarpedon, a new internal threat was brewing, one that would nearly tear the chapter apart a second time. The second chapter war was on the horizon, sparked by a young soul drinker with dangerously radical ideas. Chapter 5. The Second Chapter War, Schism and Revelation. After Entymion 4's fiery end, the Soul Drinkers regrouped aboard their space hulk Brokenback. Their numbers were perilously low now by some counts. Around 300 Marines remained. However, the chapter had done something in the interim. They had begun recruiting again. Yes, even as renegades, the Soul Drinkers still had the means to induct new blood. On worlds where the Imperium's hand was weak, or where the Soul Drinkers had secretly done good deeds, they quietly found aspirants. Many of these recruits came from populations disillusioned or oppressed by the Imperium, which is understandable, since Sarpedon wasn't exactly recruiting on Macrog, or some bastion of loyalty. One such world, name not widely recorded, but hints say it was a planet that hated the Imperium for whatever reason. Maybe it was exploited by corrupt nobles or suffered under tyrants, provided the chapter with a cadre of new initiates. These novices had passed the trials and received gene seed, swelling the chapter's ranks a bit. Yet, they came in with very different perspectives from the older veterans. They had grown up resentful of Imperial authority, perhaps seeing the Emperor as a distant figure overshadowed by the cruelty of his bureaucrats. Sarpedon probably thought, "These lads will make fine soul drinkers. They already question the Imperium's righteousness, just as we have learned to." And to an extent, that was true. However, he might not have realized just how extreme some of their sentiments were. Among these new Marines was Sergeant Eumenes. Eumenes was charismatic, daring, and had a fiery hatred for the Imperium's institutions. To him, Sarpedon's renegade war against Imperial injustice wasn't going far enough. Why merely hide and strike at outlying targets? Eumenes had a grand vision. Strike at the very heart of Imperial power, tear down the false edifice, and start anew. In his mind, the Emperor, if he still mattered at all, would thank them if they could wipe the slate clean of the decaying Imperium, even if it meant drastic measures. And by drastic, Eumenes had something unthinkable in mind. Kill the Emperor to save the Emperor's dream. It sounds insane, and it is, but here's the line of thought. The Emperor's existence as a withered corpse on the Golden Throne is what keeps the Imperium's tyranny going from Eumenes' viewpoint. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon, is the lifeline of Imperial dominance. If one could extinguish the Astronomicon, i.e., destroy the Emperor or sever his connection, the Imperium's unity would collapse. Yes, billions would be lost in the warp without guidance. And yes, it'd be cataclysmic, but out of that chaos, perhaps a new, purer human order could emerge, no longer shackled by an oppressive Imperium. It's a very ends justify the means revolutionary mentality, something akin to, we must destroy the village to save it. Eumenes managed to gather a following among the newer soul drinkers with this radical doctrine. He probably pitched it quietly. Brothers, why do we skulk and nip at the Imperium's heels? We have the power to truly change the galaxy. The Emperor's light guides their ships. If it went out, we could start over. No High Lords, no Inquisition. A new age freed from those who betrayed us. Some of the war-weary older Marines might have scoffed or been horrified, but many younger ones who didn't have the same reverence or memory of glory days were swayed. They wanted to hit back at the Imperium painfully, and what's more painful than severing humanity from its god-emperor? It was heresy of the highest order, more heretical than anything Sarpedon ever contemplated. Ironically, but in the echo chamber of the renegade fleet, it found traction. Sarpedon was oblivious initially. He was busy planning practical survival and perhaps targeting more chaos or alien threats that he felt would prove their loyalty. It was Chaplain Iktinos who noticed Eumenes' growing influence. Perhaps some novices under confession or counsel revealed odd zeal about a grand strike at Terra, or Eumenes approached Iktinos himself for support. Now, Iktinos was a complicated character. Outwardly, he was the last chaplain of the chapter, shepherding their faith. But Iktinos also harbored secret loyalties, something that would come to light later. At this stage, what matters is Iktinos didn't immediately purge Eumenes. Instead, he gave Sarpedon advice. Perhaps we should direct our next move to a place called Vanqualis. It's under attack by orcs and needs help, plus we could resupply there. This suggestion was part of a larger scheme, unknown to Sarpedon, tied to Iktinos' own agenda, an agenda connected to the deep past of the chapter, to Dionysos' hidden plan. Unwittingly, by following Iktinos' advice, Sarpedon was stepping into a trap millennia in the making. So the Soul Drinkers headed to Vanqualis, a jungle world under orc invasion. Why Vanqualis? Allegedly because they needed a safe harbor to regroup and reprovision, and what better way to earn goodwill, or at least gain breathing room, than to save a world from orcs. Vanqualis also had an old friendly link to the chapter the Howling Griffins chapter had sworn to protect it in the past, some ancient debt. But Sarpedon probably didn't know about the Griffins' involvement yet. Upon arriving at Vanqualis, the Soul Drinkers indeed found orcs rampaging. They deployed into the steaming jungles, ambushing greenskin warbands and aiding isolated human forces. All the while, Sarpedon intended, after beating the orcs, to let the chapter rest and take on supplies from Vanqualis' grateful population. It looked like a straightforward mission for once. That's when Eumenes saw his chance. With many Soul Drinkers planet-side spread out fighting orcs, Eumenes enacted a coup aboard the Brokenback. He had gathered those loyal to his vision, including, crucially, some senior specialists like Apothecary Pallas. Yes, the very Pallas who had saved them from mutation. Pallas had grown disillusioned with Sarpedon's leadership. He likely saw Sarpedon's decisions leading them from one disaster to another and believed the chapter was doomed under him. Eumenes' bold plan to strike at the heart of the Imperium perhaps seduced Pallas as a more meaningful, if extreme, course of action. So Pallas and other officers joined Eumenes in seizing control of the Hulk. Down on Vanqualis, in the thick of orc slaying, Librarian Gresk, a trusted friend of Sarpedon's, suddenly got psychic wind of something bad above. Perhaps a panicked vox from a loyal crewman, or just intuition. He hurried to warn Sarpedon that something was off. Maybe he sensed betrayal in the warp. Moments later, the sky lit up. Eumenes had turned the Brokenback's weapons against the surface. A lance strike or orbital bombardment slammed near Sarpedon's position, obliterating a swath of jungle, and incidentally a bunch of orcs. Eumenes likely didn't care if he killed orcs or his own. Gresk realized what it meant. Eumenes was trying to kill Sarpedon with an orbital strike, essentially friendly fire to decapitate opposition. He urgently urged Sarpedon to retreat from their current forward position, some old fortress or ruin in the jungle. Sarpedon trusted Gresk's instincts and pulled his men out just before Eumenes fired again, turning that fortress into a crater. Gresk's warning saved Sarpedon's life, but in doing so, Gresk himself drew the ire of the traitors. Eumenes' loyalists on the ground, embedded in Sarpedon's ranks, realized Gresk knew too much. As they withdrew through the jungle, one of Eumenes' conspirators shot Librarian Gresk in the back, killing him to silence the psychic alarm. Sarpedon sadly could not have known in time who the traitors were amid the confusion. At this juncture, the Howling Griffins chapter entered the chat. 3 companies of Howling Griffins under their Lord Librarian Merhino had arrived to honor their ancient oath to Vanqualis. They found, to their astonishment, soul drinkers fighting the orcs, and helping the humans, ironically. Merhino, being a staunch loyalist, likely had mixed feelings. Soul drinkers are traitors, but here they are killing orcs. What is going on? Inquisitor Thaddeus, yes, the same one from before who had pursued them, was also aboard the Griffin strike cruiser, having hitched a ride hoping to find the soul drinkers. Talk about a fateful convergence. Thaddeus discovered Eumenes' plot, maybe overheard something, or got wind of Eumenes' bragging. He realized Eumenes' plan to destroy the Astronomicon. It's not every day you hear that kind of villainous scheme, and Thaddeus, ironically, saw the shades of a much greater threat in Eumenes than in Sarpedon. He tried to convince Merciano that, hey, the soul drinkers might not all be equal. One faction is aiming to do something cosmically horrific. Maybe we should consider that. But Merciano was a proud Marine, not about to trust the word of any soul drinker. When Thaddeus persisted, Merciano had enough. He accused Thaddeus of being compromised or treasonous himself when the Inquisitor even hinted at siding with Sarpedon's group. It escalated to violence. Thaddeus ended up killing a griffin who tried to detain him and fled the strike cruiser in an escape pod or shuttle, presumably to warn Sarpedon below. So now things go from bad to worse. Eumenes up above controlling the Hulk, Sarpedon stuck on the planet with orcs, and soon to arrive Howling Griffins who have no context except traitor Marines present, kill on sight. Mercaino indeed deployed his companies, focusing on eliminating soul drinkers rather than orcs, since he believed soul drinkers were behind some mysterious artifact called the Black Chalice. He thought they had a chaos artifact, thanks to some misinformation swirling around. Ironically, he thought Sarpedon's loyalists were chaos-tainted when it was Eumenes who was the true heretic, albeit of a different stripe. Mercano's forces engaged Sarpedon's loyalists in the jungle, while Eumenes' traitors mostly hung back, or even watched gleefully. To them, the ideal was Griffins kill Sarpedon for them, then they maybe slip away. It became a bizarre battle, Soul Drinkers versus Howling Griffins, with orcs still rampaging opportunistically, and Eumenes' turncoats trying to pick off key loyalists and also not get themselves killed by either side. Sarpedon found himself fighting a two-front battle, Griffins in front, his own traitors behind. During the melee, Thaddeus finally reached Sarpedon and warned him explicitly, Eumenes has taken over the Broken Back and means to kill you and execute a mad plan. Mercano, unfortunately, caught up to Thaddeus at that moment, seeing him apparently team up with Sarpedon. In Mercano's absolutist mind, the Inquisitor had betrayed them. Fueled by anger and seeing a chance to avenge the murdered battle brother on the ship, Mercano struck down Thaddeus, killing the Inquisitor before he could do more. It was a tragic end for Thaddeus. Ironically, he died trying to help the very renegades he once hunted because he finally saw who the real monster was. Nevertheless, Thaddeus's warning had reached its mark. Sarpedon understood Eumenes' coup fully now. Realizing he could not get off Vanqualis easily, Eumenes wasn't exactly going to send the Thunderhawk down to pick him up. Sarpedon had to find another way. Tech Marine Ligris was still loyal to him. Ligris was instrumental in keeping Broken Back running, and he stayed by Sarpedon. Sarpedon ordered Ligris to pretend to negotiate with Eumenes and get him to allow a shuttle up to the Hulk, under pretense of Sarpedon surrendering, perhaps. Eumenes, overconfident, allowed Ligris and a small group to return to the Broken Back. In reality, Ligris had no intention of joining Eumenes. He just needed to get Sarpedon's group back to the ship. On the surface, Sarpedon and what remained of his loyal Marines were now being hammered by howling griffins. Mercaeno and Sarpedon clashed in a dramatic psychic duel, warp lightning arcing through the rain-soaked canopy, one librarian against another. Both were powerful, and the duel ended in a stalemate of exhaustion. That's when Eumenes decided to intervene personally. Perhaps he realized the Griffins might inadvertently kill Sarpedon and deprive him of his prize leadership. So Eumenes took a drop pod or shuttle down with a cadre of his traitors, landing behind Sarpedon's lines. The traitors, now openly revealing themselves, attacked both Sarpedon's men and even took opportunistic shots at the Griffins. Hey, kill them all, right? The howling Griffins paused, confused as this new skirmish erupted, soul drinkers firing on soul drinkers. It dawned on Mercaeno that maybe there was internal strife. He might have held back a moment, not sure whom to target. This gave Sarpedon the chance he needed. Ligris had gotten a shuttle, and it descended to exfiltrate Sarpedon's group. Mercaeno, unwilling to allow any traitors to escape, charged in to finish Sarpedon before he could board. At that moment, Eumenes revealed his treachery fully. As Mercaeno engaged Sarpedon again, Eumenes sneaked up and stabbed Mercaeno from behind, slaying the howling griffin librarian lord with a cowardly blow. Why would Eumenes do that? Because from his point of view, the loyalist Marines were just pawns. He needed them out of the way so he could secure leadership. Perhaps he also thought removing the enemy psyker would leave Sarpedon more vulnerable to his own psychic attacks. Mercaeno's death threw the howling griffins into disarray momentarily, losing their leader suddenly. Eumenes then turned on Sarpedon, and the two finally dueled face to face. Eumenes had a nasty surprise. He had acquired the Soulspear. Sarpedon must have lost it when captured by Lysander, or it was stored in Brokenback, and Eumenes now wielded it. And he had picked up Mercaeno's force axe from the librarian's corpse. Dual-wielding two potent weapons, Eumenes fought Sarpedon, who probably only had his staff and claws. This was the final confrontation of the Second Chapter War, ambition and betrayal versus rightful leadership and duty. Eumenes boasted of his plan as they fought, likely telling Sarpedon how the Emperor must die for humanity to be reborn. Talk about role reversal. The supposed heretic Sarpedon was now defending the Emperor from his own novice. The fight was brutal, but Sarpedon, mutated and mightily resilient, had one advantage Eumenes didn't. Those spider legs of his were deadly and unpredictable. In a decisive moment, Sarpedon impaled Eumenes on his taloned legs, skewering the would-be usurper. Eumenes coughed up blood and collapsed, his grand dream extinguished on the jungle floor of some nowhere planet far from Terra. With Eumenes dead, the traitor cause lost its figurehead. Many of his conspirators on the ground surrendered or tried to flee. Those still on Brokenback might have attempted to hold out, but with Ligris retaking ship systems and now Sarpedon on his way up, their days were numbered. Sarpedon regrouped his battered loyalists and finally made it back to his vessel. Once aboard, he wasted no time securing the ship and rounding up all remaining traitors. Some had fled entirely indeed. Perhaps a portion of Eumenes' followers took a ship and went rogue into the void, unwilling to bend the knee again. They might have hoped to pursue Eumenes' plan on their own, or just become pirates. Their fate is unclear. Presumably, they didn't succeed in doing any real harm to Terra, as no warp beacon went out. Those traitors who remained and resisted were certainly executed. A handful might have begged forgiveness, but given the chaos they caused, Sarpedon couldn't trust them. He purged his ranks ruthlessly. This time, the chapter had no room for a third internal war. At the end of this second chapter war, the Soul Drinkers were left with about 250 Marines, if that. The novices who opposed Sarpedon mostly were gone. Apothecary Pallas, that crucial figure, had sided with Eumenes, and thus sealed his fate. He was slain, apparently by Daemon Prince Abrix's later on the Phalanx, but that's to come. But at this point, Pallas may have been captured alive. If so, one wonders what Sarpedon thought as he looked at Pallas, the savior of the chapter's gene seed, and realized even he had lost faith. It must have been a bitter pill. The Howling Griffins, meanwhile, had pulled back after their leader's death, and the revelation that the Soul Drinkers were fighting each other. Some records say the traitor Soul Drinkers used the confusion to slip away, but really where to? Possibly in the Exodus mentioned. The remaining Soul Drinkers under Sarpedon didn't pursue the Griffins. They had bigger problems, like licking wounds and leaving Vanqualis before more Imperials came. Vanqualis itself likely suffered heavy orc damage, but might have been saved by the combined unintentional efforts, though losing the Griffin commander was a high price. In the aftermath, Sarpedon reclaimed the Soulspear from Eumenes' corpse, and with it a sense of grim resolve. He had faced betrayal from within at the deepest level, and emerged still as chapter master. But these events also exposed something that deeply disturbed him. The Catechism's Marshal, their holy book written by Denaiathos, had apparently planted seeds in the chaplaincy and recruits to steer them toward rebellion, and even the Emperor's death. It was as if their revered teacher wanted the chapter to turn on the Imperium, and maybe even on the Emperor eventually. Sarpedon had begun to suspect a terrible truth, that Denaiathos' long-dead hero might have orchestrated their entire damnation. This revelation would come fully to light soon, when the Soul Drinkers were finally cornered and captured by the Imperial fists. But Sarpedon already saw that the real treachery lay deeper than any one man like Eumenes. Someone, somehow, had predicted everything, including how the Imperium would try to reabsorb or judge them via a trial. And indeed, as if on cue after the dust of civil war settled, the next threat arrived. The Adeptus Mechanicus task force that had been chasing them. Yes, those Mechanicus whose relic they stole and so on they were still hunting. They attacked the Broken Back in space, damaging it severely and forcing the Soul Drinkers to flee blindly into an obscure region. Low on fuel, battered, they dove into the Veiled region, a mysterious zone of space seldom traveled. It was here, in the Veiled region, that they stumbled on ancient Necron tomb worlds and would fight their last battles as a chapter of renown. Little did Sarpedon know that all paths were converging to a final confrontation that would test what remained of the Soul Drinkers' honor and reveal the full scope of Denaiathos' manipulation. For now, however, the Soul Drinkers had survived both the Imperium's wrath and their own corrupted ideals. They were fewer, but perhaps purer of purpose. Those who remained truly believed in loyalty to the Emperor above all, even above life, victory, or survival. And with that flame of loyalty burning in these heretics' hearts, they set course for one last stand in the darkness. Chapter 6. The Necron Gamble and the Last Stand of the Soul Drinkers. Having endured inner betrayal and barely escaping the Imperium's hunters, the Soul Drinkers limped through the Veiled region, a remote area of the galaxy shrouded by cosmic dust and rumor. Here, as their meager luck would have it, they confronted a new horror, the awakening of the Necrons. The veiled region turned out to be infested with Tomb Worlds planets, where the ancient Necron race, mechanical undead aliens, were reactivating after millions of years. It was as if the Soul Drinkers leapt from the frying pan of civil war into a fire of xenocidal apocalypse. World after world they passed showed the same pattern. Once human colonies, now silent, their populations vanished or slaughtered, and eerie metallic constructs roaming their surfaces. The Necrons were systematically exterminating all life on these worlds, as was their wont, and establishing themselves. The Soul Drinkers' space hulk, Broken Back, was failing. The Mechanicus ambush had left it low on fuel, with many systems damaged. Sarpedon needed supplies desperately, especially starship fuel, or they would be adrift and helpless. So when they came upon one of the last human-settled worlds in this region, one not yet fully overrun by Necrons, they made a bold decision. They contacted the survivors on that world and struck a deal. We will defend you against the Necrons as you evacuate, if you in turn provide us fuel for our ship. The beleaguered human colonists, terrified of both Necron death and the idea of renegade Astartes showing up, nonetheless saw this as their only chance. They agreed. The Soul Drinkers thus deployed to the planet's surface to hold off the Necron legions, while the civilians rushed to their spacecraft with whatever belongings and fuel they could gather. This stand was heroic. Picture it. Purple-armored space marines, renegades, labeled as traitors, now acting as the noble rear guard for ordinary innocents, fighting against an implacable Xenos horde. They hunkered down around the planet's main spaceport, constructing barricades from ruined tanks and collapsed buildings, and waited for the Necrons to come. And come they did. Regiments of Necron warriors marching in unison, Gauss flares slicing through the air, destroyer constructs skimming forward, unleashing green lightning, packs of flensing flayed ones skulking in the ruins, wearing the flayed skins of previous victims, a sight even a hardened space marine finds chilling. The Soul Drinkers fought magnificently. They used every tactic honed from millennia of war. Sniper crossfire to pick out Necron teleport beacons, assault squads leaping forth to smash the slower warriors before they could regenerate, bolter volleys coordinated to focus down the more dangerous Necron constructs. They were just 100 or so Astartes against endless, undying legions, but they fought as if they had nothing left to lose. In truth, they didn't. For them, every battle was now for honor alone, not reward or recognition. The evacuation was nearly complete when a Necron fleet jumped into the system. A massive Necron crown ship took orbit, and swarms of sleek Necron fighters blocked the human lifter ships from escaping. Suddenly, the plan looked doomed. Even if the Soul Drinkers could hold the ground, the civilians couldn't break the blockade to flee. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, the Adeptus Mechanicus fleet that had been chasing the Soul Drinkers arrived hot on their heels. The Mechanicus, still intent on capturing or killing these heretic Astartes, came upon a space battle already in progress with the Necrons, and they dove in guns blazing. Now, in orbit, a three-way battle erupted. Mechanicus warships versus Necron vessels versus human refugee ships trying to slip through. It was chaos. In the colloquial sense, actual chaos had no hand in this, just the madness of war. The Mechanicus quickly found their fleet outclassed by Necron firepower. Elegant alien energy beams sliced through the Martian ships, setting them aflame. Realizing they'd be annihilated if they didn't do something drastic, the Mechanicus commander must have gulped and swallowed his pride. He opened a communication to the surface, likely offering a truce or alliance with the Soul Drinkers. If we don't work together, none of us survive this. Sarpedon faced a choice. Trust the very Mechanicus who had betrayed them at the beginning, or refuse and probably see everyone wiped out. True to his pragmatic nobility, he chose to ally with the Mechanicus against the Necrons. Perhaps he thought bitterly, "We can settle our score later if we're alive." He signaled the Mechanicus fleet that he was willing to cooperate. In an unprecedented and ironic partnership, the Soul Drinkers and their once betrayers coordinated plans. Sarpedon reached out to the Adeptus Mechanicus Magos, commanding that fleet, and offered an alliance of necessity. The Mechanicus, who had once robbed them of the Soulspear, now found themselves needing these renegade Marines' help. With Necrons, there's no ego, just survival, so they agreed. Sarpedon, from the ground, directed the final phase of his plan. He realized the Necron menace wouldn't end just by holding the spaceport, they'd keep coming, and now, with orbital supremacy, Necrons could land endless reinforcements or just glass the site. The only hope was a decapitation strike, kill the Necron leadership, likely a Necron lord, or even a commanding Ceton shard, if present, hoping that would disrupt their forces. So the unlikely allies concocted a bold gambit. The Mechanicus flagship would sacrifice itself by crashing onto the Necron crown world in the system, delivering both Mechanicus Tech Guard and Soul Drinker strike teams right to the heart of enemy territory. It was a literal kamikaze insertion, insane and suicidal, but it could throw the Necrons into disarray if they managed to take out the core controlling intelligence. Chaplain Ictinos volunteered his cadre for a separate mission. They would remain behind at the spaceport to keep defending the last evacuees and to guard the rear. Deep down, Ictinos had another motive. His secret loyalties made him not want to join Sarpedon's main expedition. So Sarpedon left Ictinos and his flock behind with a chunk of Marines to hold the fort, while he took the best of his remaining warriors, including Captain Luco, Sergeant Graevus, Techmarine Ligris, Librarian Tyrendian, and others, aboard the Mechanicus flagship for the strike on the Necron tomb world named Salaka. The Mechanicus warship, heavily damaged already, plotted a collision course with Salaka. Everyone braced. With a shuddering impact felt across half the planet, the Arch Mechanicus plowed into the Necron world's surface like a spear. It was a costly landing, wrecking the ship beyond repair, but it delivered the strike force to ground zero. From the smoking crater of the crash, Soul Drinkers and red-robed Skitarii marched out together into the face of nightmare. All around were Necron constructs and defense mechanisms whirring to life. They had to move fast to find the Necron Lord's headquarters, presumably a grand tomb complex at the planet's center. Thus began an epic battle through Selaka's dark halls and obsidian catacombs. The Soul Drinkers and Mechanicus fought side by side, a sight unimaginable years prior. On one occasion, a Skitarii cohort was about to be overrun by Necron wraiths, phase-shifting horrors. A Soul Drinker Terminator squad countercharged to save them, whirling power fists dispersing ghostly machines. In another, the Mechanicus unleashed a maniple of battle servitors to blow open a sealed Necron portal, and the Astartes stormed through, bolters blazing, to cut down the Necron warriors beyond. Finally, they reached the center, the Necron crown chamber. There stood the Necron Lord orchestrating the war. Some accounts imply it was more than a normal lord, maybe an awakened Ceton shard fueling the Necron forces with unnatural power. Sarpedon confronted this overlord in single combat. He wielded the recovered Soulspear, focusing his psychic might to duel the ancient Xenos monarch. Incredibly, Sarpedon won. He struck down the Necron Lord, impaling it with the Soulspear. For a moment, victory seemed theirs, until the Necron did what Necrons do. It reanimated almost instantly, grabbing Sarpedon in a vice grip. The Necron Lord started crushing Sarpedon, its strength inexorable. It looked as though the chapter master would be snapped like a twig. And then, with an act of supreme selflessness, Techmarine Ligris intervened. Ligris charged the Lord, possibly carrying a clutch of melta-bombs or a relic weapon, and sacrificed himself to permanently destroy the Necron Overlord. In the explosion or struggle that followed, the Necron was finally shattered. Ligris paid with his life, but the Overlord's command over Salaka's legions faltered. Suddenly, across the planet and perhaps the region, Necron forces faltered in coordination. On the orbiting ships, Necron captains hesitated long enough for Mechanicus survivors to escape. On the ground at the spaceport, some Necron warriors collapsed or retreated without orders. It was the turning point they needed. Sarpedon gathered the survivors of the strike force, including his own remaining Marines, and signaled for extraction at the rendezvous point. They trekked back to the crash site expecting transports, but what they found were 3 Thunderhawk gunships in yellow livery waiting instead. That was not the agreed pickup. As they looked around, golden terminators of the Imperial Fist's first company suddenly teleported in, encircling the area. Leading them was the formidable First Captain Darnath Lysander himself. It turns out that during all this, the Imperial Fists, tipped off by Mechanicus or Inquisition, or simply monitoring, had tracked the Soul Drinkers to Salaka and saw a chance to capture them. The moment the Necron threat was neutralized, the Imperial Fists pounced. Sarpedon, bruised and exhausted, nonetheless calmly faced Lysander. The first captain announced that by order of Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh and the High Lords, the Soul Drinkers were commanded to surrender and face Imperial justice for their crimes. If they resisted, they'd all die there. Lysander, honorable to a fault, even offered Sarpedon a final courtesy, the right of single combat. Perhaps out of respect as one son of Dorn to another, since the Soul Drinkers were still believed to be of Dorn's gene line, Lysander accepted Sarpedon's invocation of an old custom. Chapter Master versus Chapter Champion. Winner decides the fate of the chapter. Sarpedon probably knew in his heart he was outmatched. Lysander was at peak form. Sarpedon was heavily worn down and physically battered. But with stoic courage, Sarpedon dueled Lysander. The fight was short and one-sided. Lysander's might and skill were undeniable. He defeated Sarpedon, disarming him and leaving him broken on the ground. Sarpedon had made an agreement, or perhaps even an order to his men beforehand. If he fell, the Soul Drinkers must surrender to prevent their annihilation. Grimly, Captain Luco upheld that oath. He commanded the remaining Soul Drinkers to lay down arms. They did so after everything. They weren't going to throw away their lives in a futile last stand, not when their leader had expressly given them an out to survive. Thus, in a twist of fate, the Soul Drinkers who had survived so much by defiance saved themselves by yielding. Lysander and the Imperial Fists took them prisoner, likely with a mix of respect for their prowess against Necrons and disdain for their traitorous history. They gathered up the wounded Sarpedon and all survivors, loaded them onto the Thunderhawks, and lifted off Salaka's surface. Now, prisoners, the Soul Drinkers were brought aboard the Great Star Fortress Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery, and one of the most sacred relics of Dorn's legacy. There, Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh convened a unique event, a formal trial of a Space Marine chapter. This was unprecedented. Usually, renegades are purged without ceremony. But the Fists, in their honor, decided to give the Soul Drinkers due process, likely wanting to set an example. They assembled a conclave of peers, representatives from various Dornian successor chapters, Crimson Fists, Howling Griffins, etc., plus some neutral chapters like the Doom Eagles and Silver Skulls to observe and judge. The Inquisition sent an envoy too, and even some Adepta Sororitas were present to witness. This was to be a trial by fellow Astartes, a jury of their brothers, and a sister or two, figuratively. The evidence was presented of all the Soul Drinkers' crimes, attacking Mechanicus, fighting other Marines, the events on Entymion 4, etc. The prosecutor chosen was none other than Brother Rhinez of the Crimson Fists, who had eagerly volunteered to prosecute the ones who shamed him. Rhinez, burning with the chance to redeem his lost honor, laid out a damning case, painting the Soul Drinkers as long corrupted by chaos, citing their association with the Black Chalice rumor and the presence of mutations among them. Rhinez implied they'd been secret chaos servants all along, orchestrated by some dark design to strike at the Imperium. During the trial, explosive revelations came to light, truths even Sarpedon hadn't fully grasped. One such shock was when the Angel's sanguine representative revealed the gene seed analysis. The Soul Drinkers were not genetically related to Rogal Dorn as they had always believed. The sample tested indicated a different, untraceable lineage. Gasps from the assembly. A chapter that doesn't descend from its recorded Primarch? Heresy? Or subterfuge? This put into question their very founding history. But the biggest bombshell came from interrogations of the Soul Drinkers themselves. Under careful and maybe enhanced questioning, one prisoner divulged that the chapter's legendary hero, Chaplain Dainyathos, was not dead at all. In fact, he had been secretly preserved as a dreadnought and hidden on Selaka for millennia, pulling strings the whole time. This was mind-blowing. Dainyathos, a supposed paragon who wrote their holy book, had in truth orchestrated the seeds of heresy within his own chapter's doctrines, then gone into hidden hibernation to see it play out centuries later. Scout Marines sent by the Fists found Dainyathos's hidden tomb on Selaka with cunning traps, like only a space marine could reach it. Dainyathos, now awakened willingly, let himself be captured and brought to the Phalanx. He wanted to be there for the finale of his grand plan. So when the Soul Drinkers looked on, in marched an ancient dreadnought, bearing Dainyathos's withered form and mind, still eloquent as ever. Iktinos, remember him? And his flock, who had been captured too, suddenly reacted. They revered Dainyathos, and here was their secret master returned. This confirmed to Sarpedon a suspicion that Iktinos had been manipulating events for Dainyathos all along. The advice to go to Vanquales, etc. Dainyathos, being a hammy mastermind, decided the trial was the perfect stage to enact his endgame. As evidence was weighed and arguments made, Dainyathos's cultists, the Order of the Blinded Eye, secretly made moves. They triggered a prison break for the Soul Drinkers. Chaos erupted, no literal demons yet, just confusion. But it was a diversion. Dainyathos's true goal was to open a secret warp gate hidden within the Phalanx itself. Yes, unbelievably, he had placed a warp gate artifact, the Predator's Eye, aboard the Phalanx way back in M36 during the Age of Apostasy, when Dorn's sons helped overthrow Vandyre. The trial provided cover to unlock it, using a key, the gene code of Rogal Dorn. To get that, Iktinos' men kidnapped Captain Nicolo of the Iron Knights, one of the successor chapter reps, and used his Dorn-derived blood to open the ancient seal. Suddenly, a portal to the warp yawned open in the depths of the Phalanx. Out poured demons of Tzinch, led by a familiar fiend, Daemon Prince Abraxas, architect of the Soul Drinker's misery, now finally fully manifest and ready to use the Phalanx as a demon-spewing chariot across the galaxy. Dainyathos revealed his motive. He wanted to unleash such suffering and chaos that the Imperium would be destroyed and reborn, with him ruling as some dark messiah over a purer mankind freed from fear. Twisted logic, he's basically a chaos-tinged megalomaniac. At this pivotal moment, the Soul Drinkers had a choice: join Denyathos, like Iktinos, and about half their number did, or stand against him with their former enemies. The majority of Soul Drinkers, those still loyal to Sarpedon, recoiled at being pawns in this mad scheme. After all their struggle to stay loyal to the Emperor, they weren't about to become Danyathos' minions now. Sarpedon, regaining freedom in the chaos, rallied his true loyalists and joined forces with the Imperial Fists and allies to fight off the demonic invasion and stop Danyathos. The Phalanx turned into a war zone, Astartes of many chapters, sisters of battle, inquisitorial agents. All these disparate factions who moments ago were at trial, now united against a flood of warp entities. Abraxas himself tore through decks with magical blasts, cackling that all had gone according to his Architect of Fate plan. Chaplain Iktinos and his flock actively aided Denyathos, turning on their brethren. They ambushed Sarpedon and killed a number of his last marines. Enraged, Sarpedon hunted Iktinos down amid the libraries of the Phalanx. A vicious duel unfolded, culminating with Sarpedon using his psychic power, the Hell, to literally mind-shatter Iktinos, then ejecting the treacherous chaplain into space through an airlock poetic justice. Meanwhile, Captain Luco led the remnant Soul Drinkers alongside Imperial Fists in a last stand in the Phalanx's Librarium. They were badly outnumbered by demons. Many fell, including Librarian Tyrendian in an epic sacrifice. He allowed himself to be devoured by a great unclean one from within, then exploded his psychic lightning to kill it metal as heck. Just as extinction loomed, something unexpected happened. The Imperial forces suddenly pulled back from fighting the Soul Drinkers. Why? Because they realized the bigger threat, Abraxas, was at large in the ship. Pew and Lysander decided to trust the Soul Drinkers' offer. Luco had stepped forward and begged Pew to allow them to fight and die alongside the Fists to fix this mess. Pew grudgingly agreed. So, side by side, Soul Drinkers and Imperial Fists and others charged into the demon horde. Sister Ascarion of the Sororitas even fought with Luco and Graevus, bolstering them with faith. Together, they confronted Abraxas. In a climactic battle, Graevus, the mutated giant with a power axe for a hand, delivered the decisive blow that banished Abraxas back into the warp, likely cleaving him while others distracted. With Abraxas gone, the warp gate started to shut. But Luco and Graevus, both gravely wounded and emotionally drained, looked at each other and realized even if they lived, their fates were sealed. They'd be prisoners again, and now even more of their brethren were dead. They saw no place for them in the galaxy anymore. In a final act of defiance, or perhaps of seeking redemption, Luco and Graevus voluntarily stepped into the dying warp portal, effectively committing themselves to the unknown beyond rather than face what awaited in reality. The gate closed behind them, leaving none of Sarpedon's men on that side except Sarpedon himself. And what of Sarpedon? He had hunted down Danyathos in the command deck. The cunning dreadnought confronted his protege-turned-pawn. Danyathos tried to reason or gloat, explaining his grand vision. The Imperium needed burning, so a better one rises, etc. Sarpedon wasn't having it. They fought in a lopsided battle. Denyathos' dreadnought form hammered Sarpedon, nearly killing him. Denyathos picked Sarpedon up in his power fist, about to crush him like an insect. Sarpedon, in one last desperate move, pulled the Soulspear from a pouch at his side. He had taken it back from Eumenes earlier. Activating its twin blades and vortex field, he thrust it upward right into Danyathos' sarcophagus, severing the dreadnought's torso from its base. Danyathos fell, crippled. Sarpedon ripped open the dreadnought casing, grabbing the shriveled, cybernetically wired body of Denyathus inside. With righteous fury, Sarpedon dragged the screeching philosopher out like trash. He then proceeded to carry Denyathos's remains back toward the others. By the time he arrived at the main hangar, the demons had been defeated and the portal closed, with Luco and Gravos gone through. The Imperial fists and allies beheld a battered, bleeding Sarpedon holding the pathetic husk of Denyathos. He denounced Denyathos before them, explaining how this ancient hero had been the architect of the Soul Drinker's fall, manipulating them to serve chaos unwittingly. He implored the Imperials to learn from this, that sometimes the rot comes from revered places, that they must be vigilant against such hidden corruption. Pugh, hearing him out, was moved. The assembled Imperials realized that indeed the Soul Drinkers had, in the end, proven loyal. They fought to save the Phalanx and Imperium from a chaos plot, when they could have taken the chance to side with Denyathos. It didn't absolve all their earlier actions, but it certainly cast them in a different light, as pawns resisting their puppet master. Nonetheless, duty demanded Pugh take Sarpedon into custody now and likely sentence him. Sarpedon, seeing that his chapter was effectively gone, only he and maybe Gravis and Luco left alive, but those two had vanished into the warp, so literally just him of the original Soul Drinkers stood present, made a final dramatic choice. He wouldn't go meekly to some execution or penitence crusade. Instead, he locked eyes with Pugh and reopened the warp portal with psychic strain. The swirling predator's eye flickered back to life behind him. Denyathos, in Sarpedon's grip, finally showed fear. He screamed and begged not to be taken into the warp, all his grand talk, but he was terrified of facing the Dark God's punishment for failure. Sarpedon ignored his pleas. He declared that he would depart now, dragging this traitor with him into whatever damnation awaited, sparing the Imperium from having to judge him further. It was almost like seppuku, a warrior's suicide to preserve some honor. With one last salute or challenge to the Imperials to do better than I did, Sarpedon stepped back into the portal, hauling the shrieking Denyathos with him. The warp gate then slammed shut for good. Silence fell. The Soul Drinkers chapter was no more, not in real space at least. Only corpses and memories remained on the Phalanx. The Imperial fists, deeply impressed by the turn of events, did something gracious. They decided to honor the Soul Drinkers as brothers in death. Within the Phalanx's apothecarion, they carved a stone column listing all the Soul Drinkers who fell defending the Phalanx from Abrix's and Denyathos's scheme, right beside a column listing the Imperial fists who died in that same battle. In that hall, the Soul Drinkers' names were etched as fellow Astartes who gave their lives for the Emperor, effectively redeeming their legacy in the eyes of at least these Imperial fists. However, officially, the High Lords didn't suddenly pardon a renegade chapter. In fact, after this, they issued an edict of obliteration. All records of the Soul Drinkers were to be erased, their names struck from the annals, as if never existed. This was done to prevent their story from inspiring other wayward thoughts in Marines. It was an inconvenient example that traitors could find redemption. The Imperium doesn't like complex narratives. They prefer simple black and white. And so the Soul Drinkers chapter passed into myth and secrecy. For the next century or two, hardly anyone spoke of them except as a cautionary footnote. See what happened to those who stray. But also, quietly, they saved our fortress, though. Yet the tale doesn't quite end there. In the era Indomitus, the current age after the Great Rift opened, the returning Primarch Robute Guilliman ordered the creation of many new chapters with the surge of Primaris Marines. Among these, intriguingly, he authorized one to carry the name Soul Drinkers again. Perhaps Guilliman found some hidden record, or Pew advocated it, we don't know exactly why. But a new Primaris-only Soul Drinkers chapter was founded. These fresh Marines, drawn from Ultima founding gene stock, had no idea of the full sordid history of their name. They were taught only that the Soul Drinkers had once been an honored chapter that vanished, likely to gloss over the heresy part. Eager to prove themselves, these new Soul Drinkers fought valiantly in early Indomitus Crusade actions, like the Keprian Reclamation, where they indeed did well but attracted inquisitorial scrutiny by unconventional methods. When it came out who their namesakes were, that the original Soul Drinkers had been excommunicated traitors, the new Marines had a collective existential crisis. Imagine being a Primaris bred for loyalty, and learning your chapter's name is synonymous with heresy and betrayal. It rattled them. They started digging for the truth, questioning their identity and purpose. Could they ever truly be accepted with that tainted name? Or were they destined to follow the same path? It's a heavy burden they now carry. This new Soul Drinkers chapter struggles under the shadow of a legacy they never earned, but are nevertheless judged by. Some among them push to live up to the Emperor's ideals, even harder to redeem the name. Others harbor resentment that they were saddled with a shameful name without being told. Will they rise above that and forge a new legend? Or repeat history through doubt and overcompensation? That remains to be seen. And so the saga of the Soul Drinkers comes full circle, from a proud founding by Dorn with the gift of the Soulspear, through centuries of loyalty, then the cunning corruption by one of their own idols, the plunge into rebellion, the fight to retain true loyalty amidst condemnation, and ultimately a sacrificial stand that both destroyed them and restored their honor in a bittersweet way. Conclusion. The story of the Soul Drinkers is a tragedy of misplaced faith and unwavering principle, of corruption from within and redemption through sacrifice. They were branded heretics, yet to the very end they believed themselves the Emperor's faithful, and in the final crucible aboard the Phalanx, they proved it with blood. Their name became a cautionary whisper in the Imperium. On one hand, a warning of how even the most zealous can fall. On the other, an example that even the fallen can find nobility again in service to humanity. In the grim darkness of the far future, the line between loyalty and heresy is razor thin. The saga of the Soul Drinkers teaches that sometimes those cast out as traitors might hold truer to the Emperor's light than those who judge them. It is a sobering reminder that the Emperor's vision can be betrayed in the halls of power as much as on the field of battle, and that heroes can arise from the most unlikely of places, even among heretics. The Soul Drinkers are gone, but their legend, suppressed though it is, endures in the whispers of those who know. A chapter that defied the Imperium but never the Emperor, that died saving the very realm that had condemned them. In the end, they truly were, as their epitaph might read, the most loyal of heretics.